Welcome everyone to Video Chess Training on YouTube. I'm International Master William Paschall. Today we have an exciting game from the Norway 2016 tournament. Playing white in this super tournament feature many strong players, including Magnus Carlsen, is Pentala Harikrishna, the Indian grandmaster who has been 2700 plus for a good while now, possibly over 10 years. And playing black is Chinese grandmaster Li Chao, who was a last-minute replacement in this event for Sergei Karyakin, who withdrew due to tiredness from his last tournament, the Candidates World Championship tournament, where he qualified for the World Championship match against Carlsen. Karyakin claiming that he was very tired, so it was too much for him to play this event as well. So Li Chao doing a good job filling in that last-minute role for Karyakin. Anyway, Harikrishna performing pretty well, several victories in this tournament midway through. He's playing white here, very, very strong, aggressive, positionally based player. d4, knight to f6, now Harikrishna c4, and Li Chao I don't know too well, but he's playing King's Indian move order here, or Grunfeld. And Harikrishna plays f3, and some refer to this as an anti-Grunfeld. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. White has to be willing to play the Zamish variation against the King's Indian. So I don't think just anybody can play f3 simply for the reason of avoiding the Grunfeld. It's more part of an overall repertoire and system when you play d4 against any kind of fianchetto defenses. But here black has options. He could play d5, going into a Grunfeld type of structure. And it's still basically a Grunfeld type of position, just black won't be able to exchange a knight on c3. However, the move f3 is a bit slow for white in the Grunfeld. This line has been discussed in some detail in recent Grandmaster games and is quite interesting. Alternatively, black can play bishop g7, going into a normal kind of King's Indian Samish variation, where white hasn't developed a knight to c3 yet, but most likely will. Instead, he played c5. Li Chao played c5 right away, going for a Benoni type of idea. This is certainly reasonable. Black could play Benko or Benoni type of position, where white has played f3. White plays d5. I think this move is absolutely forced for white. He's taken time with the relatively slow move f3, so he can't really afford the position to open up too early with this early commitment to f3. Now black played d6. Obviously, another possibility would be to play either e6 or maybe b5, going into an f3 variation of the Benko. But in truth, f3 is a pretty reliable line of the Benko for white, so I'm not sure how many players would really want to test that. Anyway, kind of unusual move order, voluntarily going into a Benoni or King's Indian, where white has already played d5, but it's perfectly reasonable for black. e4, white has more space here, but has committed his pawn chain to c4, d5, e4, f3. Black can choose his setup as he wishes. Bishop to g7, and now knight to e2. This is a tricky and interesting order of moves. The first time I saw this was the International Master Dimo Werner playing it in some tournaments in Budapest, again about 10 years ago. But I mean, I'm sure that he borrowed it from someone else, and it's been floating around for a good while. But it's an interesting idea. Oftentimes in the Samish variation of the King's Indian, the white knights are a little difficult to deal with. Oftentimes the knight's on c3, the b knight's on c3 already, and the g1 knight is tricky. It goes to e2, maybe g3, or maybe e2 and then to c1. But it's kind of hard to get it to a really good square at the early stage of the opening. So this is an attempt to kind of circumvent that and to put the knights on ideal squares, maybe knight c3 and knight d2 for the white knights, like in some lines of the classical King's Indian. It's a tricky and interesting line. Knight e2, and then castles from black, knight on e to c3, that's the point now. So white can put maybe bishop on e3, and then this b1 knight to d2 a little later on. Possibly it can go to a3 and c2 as well. Now here black played e5. I would think that there would be some reason to play a normal type of Benoni type of setup. With e6, this would be valid as well. You could play e6 here. But Li Chao played e5, And one thing is that the white knights are moved away from the king side, so black could have more than his fair share of kingside threats in a King's Indian type of position. He wouldn't normally have so many threats in the regular order of moves in the Samish, where this white knight is possibly going to h3 or e2. It's kind of in the vicinity of the king side, so perhaps Li Chao is thinking he could get an early sort of kingside attack with e5, but white rules that out right away. If white plays a quiet move, something along the lines of bishop e3 or bishop e2, black could play knight to h5 here. But instead, white plays g4 and stops knight h5 altogether, with the idea of slowing down the normal King's Indian attack. And here black has played this position just infrequently. The only game I could find from this particular position, black played knight e8. And this was an old game where I believe Walter Arancibia, the Cuban grandmaster, was playing. g4, knight e8, and h4 now, stopping queen h4 check would seem forced after knight e8. This is an interesting line. Perhaps black would play here the move bishop f6. I analyzed this when white might continue with the adventurous h5, bishop h4 check, king d2, with an unclear position. The white king journeying over to the queen side. White has more space on the king side, but still there are threats along the h-file long term. And if black chooses to exchange bishops with something like bishop g5, king c2, if we trade bishops on c1, bishop takes c1, queen takes c1, you can see white has threats with the rook and the queen coming into h6, so black would have to defend a little bit passively and carefully not to be in trouble here. An interesting alternative, knight e8, to the text move in the game. After g4, Li Chao here played the move that most computer engines like here, h5. An active move. This is not an unusual idea in the Samish King's Indian. There are other lines of the Samish King's Indian where the center is closed and black also reacts to g4 with h5. So this is kind of a known idea strategically. Now white could play g5 in this position, but that could be handled by knight to h7 with pressure on g5 and the idea of breaking with f7, f6. Normally that would give black enough counterplay. On the half-open f-file, white is a little bit backwards. Black has some active counterplay in these type of lines. So Harikrishna prefers here h3, keeping the tension on the king side. And Li Chao reacts with a plan that has been used in other lines of the Samish, knight h7. The idea being that if white takes on h5, with g takes h5, we have queen h4 check, picking up the h-pawn with the queen. Queen takes h5. Therefore, keeping black's pawn structure in one whole form, not allowing the pawns to be broken up. Queen h4 check, unpleasant for white, and the position would remain unclear. So instead of g takes h5, Harikrishna plays bishop e3, and now h4 was played by black. I suppose that black could try to find a different move in this position other than h4, because white isn't actually threatening to take on h5 yet. Only when the white king moves is white threatening to take on h5. So I suppose h4 could be delayed. But Li Chao played h4 here. Queen d2 from Grandmaster Pentala Harikrishna. And now the classic plan, bishop f6. This is the idea with h4. Black will hold up the dark squares and create a kind of dark square blockade, hopefully locking the position with bishop g5 and fixing all of white's pawns on white squares. You can see h3, g4, f3, e4, d5, c4, making the white bishop on f1 a bad piece. So it's a sort of standard Samish variation idea in closed structures. And now we see that Harikrishna is actually prepared for this, because he plays a bit of a strange looking move at first, rook g1. The idea being what happens in the game. After bishop g5, white is threatening to gain space here with g5. After bishop g5, which is the stock idea for black, bishop takes g5, and I suppose black could theoretically play knight takes g5. But queen takes g5 is logical move, trying to trade queens and avoid a direct attack by white on the king side. So knight takes g5 is possible, but queen takes g5 seems the most logical, and attempts to trade queens, avoiding any kind of grave danger in the position. So queen takes g5. The problem is that white has this move, knight to b5, and this is, I'm thinking this is a trick that Harikrishna has planned out in advance. This is a kind of preconceived strategic idea. So Harikrishna knew that he could break the dark square blockade with the trick knight to b5, get black's queen off of g5, and actually there's a double threat of knight c7 and knight takes d6. Li Chao has to break the blockade with queen e7, and now Harikrishna gets in g5. This ensures white a space advantage, and also ensures that black can't get the dark square blockade that he wanted on the king side. And now things are a little more complicated. The h4 pawn is sort of artificially isolated, for one thing. So the position remains very dynamic. Black didn't get the blockade he wanted. And here, black reacted sort of automatically, I thought, with a6 in this position. But it's not clear to me that necessarily black has to play a6. He could just try to develop the pieces without weakening the pawn formation more with the move knight to d7. And I think this is interesting. Knight d7, possibly planning knight b6 and development without any weakening of the pawns whatsoever. Knight d7, knight b6, bishop d7. We could possibly oust the knight on b5 without loosening black's pawns. But Li Chao plays a6, thinking that it's a kind of useful move in the Benoni structure. Maybe he'll get in b5 later. I'm not really sure if it's accurate. Okay, so a6, knight f5 to c3, and now knight to d7. And Harikrishna has a little bit of a question about how to develop. He wants to develop naturally, but the queen is taking the knight square, the best square for the knight. He could play knight a3 here, certainly, but he chooses to move the queen. Now, queen e3 would have been a very natural square for the queen, keeping g5 protected, protecting f3 and making way for the knight d2. But he chooses instead queen to g2, which gives him sort of frontal pressure along the g-file. This actually discourages black to break. It discourages black from breaking with f6, at least visually. And here, black could again try to play knight b6, but it looks a little like awkward for the knight, and it's blocking the b pawn. So black plays king g7, a natural plan, although we are directly in the line of some heavy pieces. If black's going to play f6, the position is going to get very, very double-edged. Knight to d2, and there it is, sure enough, f6. Li Chao challenging Harikrishna directly on the king side. So both sides fighting for the same side of the board, more or less. G takes f6, queen takes f6, protecting g6. And normally in the King's Indian, white is sort of playing on the queen side, where he has a spatial advantage thanks to the d5 pawn in this classical kind of King's Indian structure. White normally playing on the queen side, black on the king side. But sometimes in the same variation with f3, things are not so clear. White can attack on the king side or the queen side, and this is one of those cases for sure. Now white could have castled queen side, but instead he began to maneuver a very interesting thing, knight d1. Knight d1 with ideas of knight f2, knight g4, or knight e3, and knight f5 and knight g4. So this kind of classic same-ish maneuver, knight to d1. The alternative would be castles queenside, which is certainly okay for white as well. Knight d1 now, rook f7. Why is black making this move? Probably simply to give the knight a square at f8. But in this game, throughout the rest of this game, I did see something I didn't really like about black's position, is the fact that black plays knight on 8 to f8, or sorry, knight on 7 to f8, knight on d to f8, and the knight on h7, the knight on f8, they're sort of overlapping. They're not really coordinating well. So there is this question about this position. Should these knights be positioned like this on f8 and h7? He had trouble getting coordinated after that. So knight to f2. In this position, I think Harikrishna has to consider knight e3 as well. For the knight, he played knight f2. Then knight on d to f8. And now knight to d3. And you may wonder what's up with knight to d3, but besides just putting the knight on a central square, this is a hint that white is thinking about breaks, pawn breaks with f4. And it's a very important idea in any kind of Benoni structure, the idea of breaking f4. So b4 and f4, these are white's pawn breaks. b5 is black's pawn break here. And black played it right away, b5. I think that the only reason this move is really kind of dubious, in my opinion, b5, is because black had a better move. I've notated this move as a dubious move, not because it's bad in itself, because I think black had something better here than this standard pawn break. This was the moment where black could have played g5. g5, fixing the king side. And now there are a couple possibilities. This would limit white's play. It really would limit white's play. It also gives black knight g6, knight f4. So if white castles queenside here, which is the safest move, castles queenside, knight g6, this stops white's attack on the king side. I think black has equal chances. White has a little bit more space overall, maybe, but I think black is equal. So the critical line was g5 and now f4, which is an idea that comes up in the game. This is a different position from the game, but not such a bad one. It actually becomes a kind of what's called by Hans Kmock the sealer sweeper sacrifice. f4, e takes f4, and e5, sealing the f4 square and sweeping past with the move e5. D takes e5 and knight e4, getting this valuable outpost. Queen g6, and now white has a neat move, queen e2, guarding the pawn, the square e4, and giving him the e3 square. In the event of f3, white simply plays queen e3. And in this position, I think white has compensation for the sacrificed pawn due to positional factors. The c5, the e5 pawns are weak. Black would possibly drop one of those at some point. Knight d7, and then castles queenside. Hard to evaluate this position. White is down a pawn. And I'm not sure that taking the c5 pawn is really the right idea here. Although possible, may give black too much counterplay with f3. So I think white has to slowly build up here. But I think that this would have been an interesting continuation with chances for both sides. So instead in the game b5, black isn't able to get in g5 in a good situation. White castles queenside, and now he played g5. It would have been better at this point to continue for black in a way that's consistent with the last move, b5. Having said b5, he should follow up with normal Benoni play, maybe rook b8 or bishop d7. Let's say bishop d7, and we're planning maybe rook b8, and the other rook, bishop e8 perhaps. The other rook can come across. We could possibly double on the b file later, or a variation like I looked at king b1. Hard to find a constructive move here for white if he doesn't have the move f4. He doesn't have a pawn break, so it's hard for white to make progress. King b1 perhaps, consolidating move. B takes c4, and then knight takes c4 and bishop b5. Getting this piece out, bishop b5, getting it active, and making way along the half-open b file. Maybe black can play rook b8, rook b7, get counterplay along the b file, or at least get this bishop out on b5 where it could trade off a piece and make black have a little bit more freedom of movement. So I think it was just a question of Li Chao being a little inconsistent, not really deciding where he wanted to play. He played b5, then he played g5, but having played one, he should probably stick with that plan and stick with this Benoni plan of b5, bishop d7, and develop on the b file. Instead, he changed plans after castles and played g5, which was a good idea originally, but in this particular position, it doesn't work because Harikrishna has a kind of death blow here, which is very thematic, actually, and Li Chao should have seen this coming. f4. It's very powerful. This exclamation point move absolutely forces a terrible position on black. f4, no choice to take it. I mean, you can't allow white to play f5 or f takes e5. both of these moves would just totally cave in the whole black position. G5 is hanging as well. I mean, there's just simply three threats, basically. G takes F5, F5, and, or E takes, F takes G, F5, and F takes E. So three threats on those three squares. It's catastrophic. Black must take with the E pawn. And then the sealer sweeper idea, again, E5. This is very thematic, freeing up the E4 square for the white pieces, weakening the C5 pawn, and giving white access to huge threats with his knights. So now the best would have been for black to take it, and the variation looks a little bit unclear, actually. White is better, but I think D takes E5, knight E4, and it's very much forced. The black queen needs to stay in the vicinity of the king's side. So queen H6, and I don't think this capture on G5 is necessarily dangerous. So best is knight takes E5, and this has to be the critical variation that both sides were looking at, but it doesn't look that clear. Maybe black isn't lost after rook E7, knight C6. We're threatening a lot of things. The rook doesn't have a lot of squares. White has a very strong passed pawn, and he's also threatening knight takes G5 in some positions. So it's a huge position, but black has this resource, bishop takes H3. It's possible that Li Chao overlooked a move like bishop takes H3, or just rejected the position because he thought this was better for white, which it is. Bishop takes H3, and now queen F3, giving white access to the C3 square, calmly just ignoring the bishop, giving white access to the C3 square with the queen. Well, there's really nothing better than black to give up the exchange here, rather than allow white a very powerful attack. And it's not that clear. Rook takes E4, queen takes E4. Black has three connected passed pawns. H4, G5, F4 for the exchange. Basically, he has, in fact, two pawns for the exchange. But in this formation, they look kind of dangerous. And then bishop D7, queen E7 check. All the black pieces are protected. King H8 and queen takes C5. This position would leave black with one pawn and a knight for a rook. But nevertheless, the three connected passed pawns make it a little bit unclear, and I'm not sure for 100% that white is winning. So this would have been a better option for Li Chao. Instead, he just kind of panicked. And when white played E5, I don't know how much time he spent here, but he played queen F5. And this guarantees white basically a winning position for sure. There isn't really anything unclear after queen F5. White has this mammoth pawn, E6. Even the move rook E1 here, instead of E6, rook E1, just piling up more pressure along the E file, would have been pretty overwhelming. So not just one move, but equally good, I think, is rook E1, just piling up more pressure along the E file, with a winning position for white. E6 is good enough, with a crushing passed pawn that just severs the black position in half. E6 and then F3. Aggressive move, but it doesn't really have too much effect. I mean, it actually weakens the D6 square. F3, queen H2, targeting the D6 pawn, the base of black's pawn chain. And now black can sacrifice a piece here several different ways. He's going to lose his whole pawn structure. D6, C5, everything's going to fall apart if black doesn't sacrifice a piece here. So it's more or less forced. He chose to play bishop takes E6. Knight takes E6 is equally problematic. I looked at knight takes E6, D takes E6, and then queen takes E6. Unfortunately, because this D6 pawn is hanging, black would like to develop, but the pawn in D6 is hanging. So queen takes E6, rook E1. And again, the black queen just doesn't really have a good square because of threats of knight to E4. Queen F6, knight E4 is really strong. He has to play queen H6, and this queen is out of play. Knight F2, for example, as Harikrishna did in the game, just cold-bloodedly blockading that pawn on F3. White is up a piece here for a couple pawns, and it really looks like loss for black. So instead, he sacrificed bishop takes E6, and then D takes E6, and again, the issue is really the D6 pawn. Black can't really afford to lose that pawn on D6, having already sacrificed a piece. So we would like to play knight takes E6, but it's not very convincing. Like knight takes E6, queen takes D6, and then knight to D4. Black is down a piece here, and in this line, white can actually trade queens. This is not the game. This is analysis of knight takes e6, and it's looking bad for black. Queen e5 check, queen takes e5, knight takes e5, rook f5, and now white can even like sacrifice a piece, similar to the game, to create a tactical threat on the long diagonal with bishop g2. Like knight takes f3, knight takes f3, rook d7 check, king g8, and knight takes f3, where we'll skewer the two rooks. And this ending, like rook takes f3, all this is forced. This looks like an easy win for white. Bishop g2, rook f8, bishop takes f3, rook takes f3, and I looked at trading pawns and playing rook d5, and this ending is lost. Right? Even if he could get two connected pass pawns, white will eat these pawns on c5 and b5 and just promote the a pawn really, really fast. So basically, after d takes e6, we go back to the game. This knight takes e6, queen takes d6. It just can't be maintained for black. So queen takes e6 was a better try. But again, we just blockade the pawn with knight f2. Harikrishna playing perfectly in this game. Never made, I think, even like one dubious move. He played very efficiently. Queen e3, trying to defend f3 and pin white, but it doesn't really have much effect. Knight to g4. And then, again, the d6 pawn is hanging. So there's also a lot of threats like bishop d3, for example, will get in the game very effectively here. So Chao played queen f4. We trade queens and go into an ending, and there's a final trick now which really finishes black off. Similar to the last line that we looked at, knight takes f3. And that just finishes it. I mean, you've already sacrificed a piece. Now you're losing the only real trump in your position. Chao dropping the f3 pawn, which is the only thing that's keeping white tied down. The threat of bishop g2 would win the exchange, so it just wins the pawn. Black takes on c4, and ironically enough, knight on g to h2, threatening g5 and threatening d6. This d6 pawn, black should defend it here. I mean, the only move essentially is rook d8 in this position. Black is lost, though. Instead, he chose to defend the g5 pawn, but it's better to play rook to d8 here. Last hope. Winning position for white, but maybe white could make a mistake or something. Instead, in the game, after knight e6, Harikrishna takes that key pawn on d6. The base of the pawn chain falls, and black's whole position just collapses. Rook takes d6, knight to d4. All the white pieces are active now. You can see rook d7. Doesn't matter where the king goes. White is just up a piece here. And all variations are bad. He has to stay next to the knight, obviously, not to drop this guy, but played king h8. It looks a little passive, but I didn't see a good move for black. And then knight e5 with a terrible threat of knight to g6 check. And by the way, the c4 pawn is hanging, and white's ready to play at any moment. Bishop takes c4, adding another piece to the kind of upcoming attack on the black king. Knight e5, knight f8, defending against knight to g6 check, and the game is in its last throws here. Harikrishna efficiently finishing it off. Rook f7, basically threatening rook takes f8, and that's what happens. White, tries to trade pieces. He's up a piece. Black tries to avoid pieces since he's down a piece. Avoid exchanging pieces. Rook e4, and rook takes g5 now, gaining a pawn and defending the knight on e5. So black is lost. Rook d8, and then this exchange, the following exchange, simply simplifies the position. Rook takes f8, rook takes f8 for black, and we are just up a piece. Knight g6 check, king g7, knight takes f8, king takes f8, rook takes c5. Clear piece up. There's nothing with rook e1 check because of the knight protecting the bishop on f1, the bishop protecting the pawn on h3, and black is just lost. All three pawns scattered, isolated, and they've reached the time control. So Chao resigned. I thought this was a really good game. There had been quite a few draws in Norway Chess in the early part of the tournament, and I thought Harikrishna really, and Chao both, showed a lot of fighting spirit in this game, which is something that should be definitely rewarded. I mean, they're not making a quick draw. Both sides clearly playing for a win in this game. So I think both players deserve a lot of credit. Chao playing the King's Indian, playing very aggressively, really fighting and taking a lot of risks, losing in the process, but he put up a good fight. I thought an interesting strategic battle. Pentala Harikrishna, impressive in Norway 2016. I'm International Master William Paschall. Thanks for joining me here at Video Chess Training, my YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and like this video and come back again. Thanks everybody, and bye.